Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to talk about what is arguably one of the best watch brands on Aliexpress, with the San Martin SN026-G. Now, like almost every brand on Aliexpress, San Martin specializes in making homage watches, and let's just say that's homage with a lowercase h, as they mostly wind up being generic versions of more famous models. However, what San Martin lacks in creativity, they more than make up for in build quality and value, which is why they've really grown in popularity over the last couple of years. But there's something interesting going on behind the scenes at San Martin, as over the last few months, I've actually noticed some new models that say they're original designs, as well as a few that list some original components. The first of which is this SN051-G2, and this is a watch I bought during the 11/11 sale. Basically, it's a black bay or subby style case that's paired with a sandwich dial and what they say is an original handset, where the hour hand here either looks like a medieval hammer or maybe a pokeball on a stick. Either way, it's a cool watch, and I thought it was a step in the right direction for San Martin, which they've continued by releasing this, the SN026-G, a rather striking 39.5mm sports watch that they've listed as having an original design. But is it really original? Well, not exactly. At least it's not completely original. There's definitely some inspiration here, and some of you may have already recognized it. But we'll get to that shortly, because before I really get into this one, I do need to let you know that this watch was provided by Aliexpress, and they're not asking for it back, hence that promotional tag. And note that I said Aliexpress, not San Martin. Now, that said, let's get to it. First off, let's talk about that originality. Because at first glance, the SN026 looks an awful lot like a BR05 from Bell & Ross. So just looking at these two side by side, I think it's pretty obvious that the SN026 was inspired by this watch. However, if you take a closer look at the San Martin, you'll notice that every aspect of the watch has been tweaked in some way, as it's a completely different style bracelet, and the dial design has been tweaked to make it something a bit more complicated. The case is probably the most identifiable component, but even there it's been modified. There's different lugs, no crown guards, and even the overall shape has been changed, making it maybe a bit more rounded and cushiony than, say, square. Technically, they're not wrong in saying that this is original, because there really isn't another watch exactly like it. But personally, I'd still call this an homage. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, as this is the type of homage that people have been asking San Martin to make for a while. The inspiration for the design is clear and apparent here, but at the same time, San Martin used their creativity to change it into something that's more their own, which is why on the homage creativity scale, which goes from 0 to 10, I'd probably give this a 5. And more to the point, this is the type of homage that I'd like to see them do more often. But let's move on from all of this and let's talk specs. For this one, San Martin went with a 39.5mm width and a lug-to-lug of 47. So theoretically, this watch head should fit a good variety of wrist sizes. It also has a 20mm lug width, flat sapphire with AR, 100 meters of water resistance with a screwed down crown, as well as your choice of 2 movement options. Total thickness isn't bad either here at 12.4mm. But the watch is still a bit heavy on its steel bracelet with a weight of around 175 grams. And I gotta say that most of that weight really feels like it's in its watch head, and I think that's thanks to its more elaborate case, which unfortunately does result in this watch feeling a bit top heavy. And that's even on a bracelet. So this is one that you really need to get a perfect fit on just to prevent it from flopping around on your wrist. But unfortunately, with only 2 micro adjusts, getting that perfect fit may be a bit elusive. Although, if you can manage it, it actually does feel pretty good throughout the day, and I gotta say, this has an amazing presence to it. But do be aware that even though this is a 39.5mm sized case, because of its square case shape, it does feel larger on the wrist. Probably more like a 41. And as long as we're here, let's talk about the bracelet for a minute. Unlike that Bell & Ross, which has an integrated bracelet, the San Martin uses a standard 20mm lug width. And the bracelet itself looks great with a 9-link design, as it just seems to mesh perfectly with the more complicated dial. You also have solid female end links, solid links secured with screws, and a really great milled push-button clasp. For the most part, it's really a great bracelet for the price. The only downsides that I've seen is the aforementioned 2 micro adjustment holes, and the edges of the links do feel a little bit sharper than that of the watch head. And one quick warning to the bigger guys out there, because with my 7¼ inch wrist, I only had to remove 1 link. So if you're more like 7.5 and above, this bracelet probably isn't going to work for you. At least not as it is. You will need more links. But let's move on to the case, which I think is one of the more interesting aspects here. It's kind of hard to really narrow down and describe the overall case shape here. With its short angular lugs and the lack of any sort of crown guards, it's kind of like a cushion meets a barrel. And then there's this window that then screwed on top of that. I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe. And I think the best thing to do with this one is really just to observe the images. It is tool watchy, and that paired with the elaborate dial and the decent 100 meters of water resistance, I think securely push this watch into sports watch territory. The 2 main things you need to know about this one is that the finish is good and that this is a watch that beautifully plays with the light. The watch head itself has an almost entirely brushed finish, except for this very narrow beveled edge that's on each of the sides, which wind up creating this sandwich effect with the brushed and polished sections of the bezel. And it's really the top edge of that polished bezel that always seems to beautifully catch the light. That's what's really going to catch your attention when you're moving your wrist around. To the right, you have a simple signed screwed down crown. The size here is just about spot on, as it doesn't stick out or visually distract from the watch while still being fairly easy to unscrew and use. And for once, I like that the branding is fairly consistent here, as the same logo is on the crown, the dial, as well as the bracelet, which isn't something San Martin always does. Now, turning the watch over, we get a glimpse of the completely barren and blank case back, which is secured on by 4 small screws. The finishing of this case back actually looks nice. We have a vertical brushing on top, as well as a polished beveled edge to it. But the lack of really anything here just kind of feels off to me. It's almost like a deserted desert landscape. It's clean, breathtaking, yet slightly eerie all at the same time. Now, back to the front, one quick word about the crystal. Here, San Martin went with a flat sapphire, which I think is the perfect choice when you're already dealing with a complicated case design. But with the overly complicated and really reflective dial underneath, I have noticed a bit of glare and reflection with this one. So no doubt, a few more layers of AR coating would drastically help. As for the dial itself, the dial is gorgeous. As of right now, there are 4 different colorways. You have blue, a silver, gunmetal gray, and this one, the green version. It's also a fairly interesting color of green too. It's not like a deep emerald green like say on the Alpinist, but more of a paler, lighter jade, which I don't think stands out quite as much, and I think that helps maintain the visual balance between the case and the dial. The dial is basically split into 3 sections. You have a smoother center section with a sunburst finish, a circular textured moat that contains the indicators, and then finally a very thin chapped ring that winds up framing everything in. The indices are applied mixture of Arabics and dashes, and that is one of the big things that this watch inherited from its inspiration, but I think the rest of the design is pure San Martin. And especially the indices just floating beautifully on top of that textured moat, which I think also allows them to really pop and stand out, as they are sandwiched in between the smoother sunburst sections. One thing that I also like here is that San Martin went with a silver framing and white-based lume, rather than say the gold framing and old radium-style lume that seems to be really prevalent with green-style dials. Perhaps that's due to the lighter jade coloring, and in comparison, I think you do lose some contrast because of that. But at the same time, this watch isn't quite as in your face as some of those others. So this is a green dial that I think is much more subtle to wear. Now, this is a no-date dial design, and as such, there's nothing here to disrupt the symmetry. But there's also a fair amount of dial real estate being taken up by the text and logo in the center section. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's too much, as all it's really saying is that this is an automatic and lists the water resistance. But just due to the design, it does look a little bit overcrowded here. Now, personally, I would have taken the water resistance off and then just moved to the back, along with anything else. because again, this just looks odd. Now, the handset used here is a little thin, but overall I like how it looks with the dial. The length of each hand is also great, where you have the hour hand just reaching into the middle section, and then the minute hand just barely kissing the chapter ring while gliding over the textured moat. Adding a red tip to the second hand was also a great idea. As thin as it is, I think it ran the risk of getting lost in that sea of reflective green. But just adding that red tip really helps it stand out, as well as adding a small splash of color. As for the lume, well, it's great, and especially for a sports watch. It's nice and bright with a good amount of longevity. In my comparison test, I'd say it mostly kept up with the Seiko Diver, and that's even with its very thin hands that don't have a lot of surface area. So whatever San Martin is doing, they're doing right. With regard to the movement, San Martin gives you a choice between two different movements. You have a choice between a PT5000 and a more expensive Sellita SW200, with this one in particular coming with the PT5000. Both of these are ETA clones, so theoretically they should be relatively equivalent. The main difference being the PT5000 is less expensive and made in China, where the Sellita is still Swiss made. I've actually had good experiences with the PT5000 movements I've seen, but if I'm being perfectly honest, I still trust the Sellitas more, just because it has a more proven track record out in the wild. That said though, with a $100 price difference, it's pretty hard to argue against the PT5000, and especially what I'm seeing with this one. One other thing to note is that the movement typically comes with a date wheel. So there is a second position for the crown, but I never felt a ghost wheel flip over while turning it. So if I had to guess, I'd say the date wheel has been removed here. Lastly, let's talk value. Now, prices do fluctuate, but I think right now these are running about $330 for the PT5000 movements and about $435 for those with a Sellita, which overall I think is pretty good when you look at everything you're getting. But at the same time, I think that also depends on what you're comparing these to. If you're looking at main brands like Seiko, then the San Martin is easily going to give you more bang for your buck. If you're looking at micro brands with similar specs, then this one is probably still going to beat those out. Although with micro brands, there may be some interesting alternatives there as well. It's only when you start to compare this to other Aliexpress watches does that value argument start to fade. As compared to your typical Ali watch, this is on the higher side. But typically those other watches are going to have a less expensive standard beat Seiko movement. And if you're looking at other brands like say Steel Dive or Pagani, I think San Martin does build a better quality watch. So the price is justified on that account as well. The only other area that I can think of where this might start to lose value is with regard to resale, as typically Aliexpress watches don't do that well on the resale market, at least not when you compare them to main brand or micros. Plus, you should always remember that there is a slight risk when buying watches on Aliexpress, as it's much harder to resolve an issue if there happens to be one, because it's not easy or cheap shipping anything back to China. And hopefully I'm not really scaring anyone away with all of this, I'm just trying to shoot you straight. Because you see, a few years ago when everyone was impulse buying $60 Cadisons on Aliexpress, that was one thing. But here, when you're talking a $300 to $500 watch, this is stuff you should at least think about. Overall, it's a really well done and gorgeous piece, striking a good balance between a massive visual presence and usability. Compared to its inspiration, the design here is a bit more elaborate, as well as a bit more crowded. If you're someone that loved the less is more approach on the Bell & Ross, or say someone that loves simple, clean, classic designs, this isn't going to be the watch for you. I just think there's too much going on here. And I think the same is true if you're someone that appreciates more subtle pieces, as the San Martin with its pretty elaborate dial is very eye-catching. I mean, this is something that's just begging for attention. But if you're looking for a gorgeous, eye-catching sports watch, one that could be at home in dressier situations, this could be a good fit for you. Anyway, that's my take on the San Martin SN026-G, of which they really need to start coming up with some nicknames because those do get kind of hard to remember after a while. Maybe this one can be the Emerald Cube. But as usual, let me know down below what you guys think about this one. In particular, what do you think about the term homage here? And do you think San Martin is going in the right direction with this? And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.